Black Horse Pub.
That was excellent.
Was that a fitting start?
Oh, that was marvellous. Blimey.
Yes, I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, we can, Richard. Yes.
Yeah. I should just say this, that my eldest daughter, who's been at home before she starts her first ever job, and she went off yesterday, and she repeatedly said to me, "Dad, I've been walking Jed, and whenever I walk him, for some reason he wants to dive into the Black Horse. Why is that?" And her mother's there, and I say, "I don't know. I don't know why he thinks that he wants to go into that pub particularly." Yeah, I think Keith, you know why.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, it's a great place.
As I've indicated to Keith, Richard, I have to just disappear for a couple of minutes while a delivery comes in.
Yeah, is that a euphemism?
Oddly enough, no.
Richard, you've been slightly poorly. How are you?
I'm on the mend, thank you, Keith. I have had a range of nurses and doctors doing things to me. One thing that rather bizarrely they've done to me is that you go there and then the first thing they do is they take 8 lots of blood out of you and they say, "We're going to put those off for testing." And an hour and a half later, they come back and say, "We need to give you more blood." And you think, well, you could have just kept the bloody stuff that was already. But no. So I feel a lot better, thank you, Keith.
Oh, good. I'm delighted to hear that. I'm sorry if I'm just looking off screen for a moment. I'm just trying to get a monitor up on YouTube to just make sure that we're going out all right. And it looks as if there's something there anyway. But in fact, I'm sure. And I think the acoustics are pretty good in this pub. Certainly the light is.
I was going to say, Keith, are you in the front bar there?
I am. He offered us the window, would you believe?
Good grief.
I said to Philip, after we've done this a couple of times, I'm going to ask if we can put a little sign in to say this is what's happening. Because the amount of traffic going past this pub in the morning is enormous. I mean, I'm amazed.
We're going to be like the Beatles. There'll be a group of young women outside screaming.
Yes, you'll have to come and guard me as I leave.
Well, I won't need to do that because you've got your jet ski thing that you drive around, so that's absolutely fine. You'll get away.
He's already seduced the cleaning lady.
Oh yes, I had coffee waiting for me.
Making him coffee on demand, amongst other things.
I promised to say hello to people on behalf of AD, but also, Richard, she's a lady that we used to talk to on the bus when we came in together.
Oh, right.
Yes, so it's amazing. There's a little family on that bus that spreads all over Lewis.
Yeah, well, you're not on the bus anymore because you go twice as quickly on your own little bus.
Well, I don't go twice as quickly, but at least I get there.
Yeah.
Right, what do you gentlemen have up your sleeve this morning?
Well, Keith, we were contemplating, and it's a slightly niche topic, the cricket controversies that we've had in recent weeks. And what I propose to do is to interview an expert. Sadly, they've become unavailable. And so I'm going to interview Phil instead about it.
Right.
So Phil, there's been a couple of really odd things that have happened in recent weeks with international cricket. So could you just very briefly fill us in on what those are for people? There may be people who aren't interested in cricket, but just fill us in generally.
Well, you and I know that we're going to expand.
Yeah, okay. Don't worry about that. Just tell us what's happened in the last couple of weeks. Just answer my questions. I'm Michael Parkinson.
No, I'm not a witness, Richard, but more than a few weeks ago, there was the controversy in the Test match between England and Australia when Bairstow, the batsman, thought the over had been completed and moved out of his crease when in fact the umpire had not called dead ball. And the Australian wicketkeeper threw the ball and dislodged the bails at the stumps, and the Australian captain appealed for a dismissal, which was allowed, and would not withdraw the appeal. And that was deemed unsportsmanlike. The more recent one was in the World Cup 50 over competition that's currently happening in India. And if I remember rightly, it's Bangladesh against Sri Lanka. And the Sri Lankan captain walked to the crease slowly, and then his helmet strap broke. So he was timed out. You have 2 minutes to get yourself onto the pitch and be prepared to face the first ball as a new batsman. And he was timed out after an appeal by Bangladesh. And again, that was given out. And he went on record to say how disgraceful and unsporting that was. So they're the incidents I recollect. Do you have any others in mind?
No. I'm conscious of the fact, and I think we both need to be conscious of the fact in this discussion that there will be a dog who knows all about his cricket, but the one man might not, by way of our audience. So we just need to break things down a little bit. There are various ways in which people can be given out. We won't go into all of those. But I think you can confirm that the umpires will not consider giving somebody out unless the opposition captain effectively says, "How's that?" makes a request. So the initial trigger is from the fielding team in both of those cases. And once they've done that, the umpire has no, as it were, discretion.
No.
They have to apply the law strictly.
Correct.
And
I mean, in fact, the Sri Lankan captain, so an umpire said after the game, had already, even before the helmet issue happened, he'd already been far too slow.
Yeah.
But it's a matter of what is the spirit of the game, you know?
Yes. It as the old phrase has it, it's just not cricket.
Well,
now, Philip, given that there are these controversies about cricket recently, you thought that it would be a good idea to discuss the biggest controversy that has ever hit cricket, which is the body line.
Quite so, Richard.
Let me just, if you don't mind, sorry. 32-33. So 1932, 1933. Just by way of background, cricket then, it was very much fundamentally the same game, but there were obvious differences from what we have today. So, for example, there was a very strict division, and this sounds ludicrous, between gentlemen and players.
Indeed so.
So there were those who were amateurs who could afford to play cricket for fun. And there were people who did it for a living and needed to earn the money. And inevitably, the power between them lay with the gentleman, not with throughout. And that's something that we will come on to, if that's okay with you, Philip. Do you think things have changed? You know, we don't have gentlemen, we don't have players. Everyone earns a buck.
Could I just make a comment on that, please, Richard?
Certainly.
I was in Hong Kong on one occasion, as one is, having breakfast in my hotel, and the Australian cricket team were passing through and came down for breakfast. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to prick a few balloons at the moment. I looked at them and watched the meeting, and I thought I wouldn't want this bloody lot in my house for dinner.
Well, there's the famous true anecdote shared by an old commentator called John Arlott and Michael Brearley, the then ex-England captain, both of whom were Oxbridge, really rather snooty. And Arlott tells the story of the Australians at lunch being served Vichy Soise. And one of them pipes up, "Oi, mate, my soup's cold." So,
can I say that John Arlott's son was in Lewis a couple of years ago to have a lunch with somebody that you know, and that we started about noon and ended just before he caught a 5 o'clock train?
You are a rogue. Do you know that?
Well, what you don't know, Philip, is that, well, you know generally that cricket back in the 30s, teams that went on tour, they went by boat.
Yeah.
So an England team going to Australia would travel by boat and spend months away and then come back. Now, what's not greatly known is it on the 32-33 tour is that there was a cub reporter on that boat with them who followed the test series called Keith. And it was his first assignment, apparently. He went along. And years later, John Arlott, the famous cricket commentator and bon viveur, said, "Now, the thing is, Keith, you could even drink me under the table." So I don't know if you can confirm or deny that, Keith.
Oh, I'm not saying a thing.
No.
Can I also say that we have in our archives, and I will play it next Monday for you, is a film made by John Arlott, more or less explaining cricket.
Right.
Now that I would like to see.
Yes, very much so. He used to turn up in the commentary room with a sort of briefcase, but it was a pilot's case, probably more like it. with 6 bottles of high quality red wine because he felt that that's what he required for a day's commentary.
I
I
can
can
well
relate to
believe
that.
it. Knowing the son, I'm sure that the father was the same.
Anyway, Phil, in 1932, England set sail fair for Australia for the Ashes, and we all know the Ashes is certainly was at the time the most highly contested tournament in cricket in the world.
Correct.
And
And why was it called the Ashes?
Tell us, Philip.
Because the first time that Australia beat England, or the Marylebone Cricket Club, which the touring sides are actually known by, at Lord's, English cricket was so shocked that a poem was written about the ashes of English cricket. The bails were all 4 bails that rest on the top of the stumps were burned, and their ashes were put in an urn, which still exists at Lord's.
And it's quite it's quite a small urn, isn't it?
It is a small urn, yeah. This is 1889 or something like that, and it was about the ashes of English cricket. They were so shocked and ashamed that they'd been beaten by these Aboriginals, essentially, these convicts, that they had a mock funeral, and that urn still exists. And the replica of the urn is exchanged every time one side wins them back or retains them. And the rule is that, for example, at the moment, I think Australia have the Ashes. They retained them by drawing with England this last time. Had England won the series 3-2, as was at one point possible, they would have regained the Ashes, and it would be for Australia to beat them in the next Test series to get the Ashes back. But currently the Ashes are with Australia. And if you do not lose a series, you retain the Ashes.
Yeah.
Now, you asked me a little while ago whether I think things are different now. Well, the difference is there are no amateurs anymore. It's all a professional game. So my opinion would be that it has changed, and probably for the better.
Yes.
Although I'm in no doubt, and Zach Crawley is a classic example, I'm in no doubt that money and background still talk. Because Zach Crawley is a classic example of a entirely publicly schooled individual where cricket particularly is still encouraged, with a very, very wealthy father, family business, who is now flourishing in the England team. So I'm not saying that influence and money has become irrelevant. It hasn't, but there's certainly no amateur or professional divide. I mean, I remember as a very young boy going to Old Trafford cricket ground, and they still had the 2 separate exits, gentlemen and players.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I remember, this would be early 60s, I'm sure I remember them coming out of those separate exits. Now, of course, that's all changed. But so it wasn't until the 60s that it changed, Richard.
No. Another difference between the Test series of 32, 33, and now, of course, and it's an important distinction for what we're going to go on to discuss, is that in the first half of the 20th century, and indeed maybe even longer. People just didn't wear any body protection, in particular a helmet.
Well, what triggered me, bad word maybe, to suggest to you we talked about bodyline was I watched yesterday a program on that very subject about bodyline. And modern technology has revisited some of the very rare footage of what happened in that series, in particular, the bowling of a man called...
Could I pause you there, Philip? So we will come on to that generally.
Okay.
I promise you.
Can you go back to being unwell? Because you're being a bit of a pest.
And can you go back into your hutch?
You're very pesky this morning.
So back in the 30s, nobody wore a helmet. They might wear a soft cap. That will be all. You know, nowadays, helmets are compulsory.
Yeah, you can't go out without a helmet.
And if the ball hits your helmet, you actually have to change the helmet.
Yeah.
So it's a very radical change. So Philip, what I wanted to ask you about are some of the characters that we will be talking about generally before you get on to your general thing. So if I give you a name, I'd invite you to give us a little thumbnail sketch of where that person plays out within the grand scheme of the 32-33, the most controversial cricket test series ever. So I'm going to ask you first about Don Bradman. There may be people who have never heard of Don Bradman. Just tell us.
Don Bradman was an Australian batsman and captain of their test side for a while. The most prolific and talented run scorer ever, without doubt. In his final appearance in England, which was in 1948, he was astonishingly bowled first ball at Lord's. Had that not happened, had he scored a run, his average would have been 100. In other words, he scored so many runs that when they were divided by the innings he played, every innings averaged out at 100 runs. He retired on 99.99 per innings. That was his average. And he was so prolific that the English were determined to negate him, to constrain him, to prevent him scoring runs.
And just putting that average into context, it's effectively double that any other cricketing batsman has produced in their career.
Yes, absolutely.
He's completely off the scale.
Yeah, completely.
But as you say, 32-33 series, he's the person that England fear because he can take their bowling apart.
Correct.
And just make a huge innings out of it. Now, his captain was Bill Woodfull, I believe.
Correct.
Who, throughout the whole process, remained an honourable figure, it seems to me.
Yeah, Bill Woodfull was himself quite badly injured. His ribs were cracked by a ball into his body.
Well, we'll come on to that, but just in terms of his character for the moment, he was an honourable chap.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. we may need to talk about Pelham Warner, who was the co-manager of the tour, who was a big name in cricket in the past. He'd retired, but was there to support the England team and had a difficult time controlling things, and it may be thought didn't control them as well as he could have done.
I personally don't think he did.
Yeah.
But he was between a rock and a hard place. I mean, it would have been impossible to be diplomatic in that scenario.
And then we've got 3 England players that we may need to talk about. Firstly, the England captain, Douglas Jardine, who, for these purposes, is the villain of the piece, isn't he?
Entirely so. Jardine was your absolutely stereotypical, publicly schooled man of the age. Even in his appearance and his stature, he was just snooty, Mr. Snooty, long aquiline nose, rather haughty sort of demeanour. He hated Australians. He hated Bradman. But he hated Australians, and he made it quite clear.
Yeah, he spoke very disparagingly about Australians generally. Apparently, he said to his team that he was leading out there on the boat that they should refer to Bradman at all times as the little B. He used the full word.
Yeah, that's correct.
Because he had no sense of decorum.
He also said, I have read, that in one of his initial team talks, he said, "You've all been born British. You have won the first prize in the lottery of life."
And then within the England team, just a couple of players that we ought to talk about, just mention in passing. Harold Larwood.
Well, Harold Larwood was, without doubt, the fastest bowler of the age. And later in this chat,
I cut you off earlier because you were telling us about the documentary you saw, and I know that you gained information from that.
Yes, well, I'm rather responding at the moment to what you want me to say. I mean, I watched a documentary whereby modern technology was applied to the old footage of Larwood bowling, because what they wanted to find out, as near as they could, was how fast he was. Because contemporaries said he was so fast, you couldn't see the ball.
And just to make it clear, nowadays they have sort of sophisticated ball tracking.
Yeah.
Part of which is the speed of the ball, and it comes up on a sort of clock like you'd have in an athletics stadium.
Yeah.
With the speed of each ball, and people can bowl in the high 90 miles per hour. That's the sort of average, the fast bowler's top end.
Well, that is the absolute top end. I think you'll find, frankly, that it's more like 92, 93 miles an hour.
Yeah.
But it turns out that if the technology got it right, Larwood was bowling regularly at over 100 miles an hour.
Which would be the fastest ever recorded.
Correct. And this documentary demonstrated how they calculated that. And they also simulated the damaging effects of a cricket ball travelling at that speed on the human body, which brings us back, when you wish me to go into it, the lack of protection.
Yeah,
so that was Larwood, and he was Larwood was Jardine's favourite because Larwood was the weapon. Larwood was the spearhead in the anti-Bradman tactics.
And Larwood was a player as opposed to a gentleman. He was
Yes.
an honest toiler.
He was a Nottinghamshire miner.
Yeah, earning his crust, getting paid for doing it, running in very fast, damaging his feet in the process, but incapable, obviously, of challenging the patrician Jardine. If the captain told him to do something whilst they were in Australia, he had no means to say no, or it would have been impossible for him to say no.
Yeah, he just wouldn't have been played, and he'd probably been sent home. There's one instance, you mentioned him damaging his feet.
Yeah.
By the time we got into the series, his feet were really badly blistered. And in one game, Jardine insisted that he did another spell. And he actually said to Jardine, look, skipper, as he called him, my feet are buggered, basically. And Jardine just said, get on with it, Harold. Get bowling. And his feet were like pieces of steak at the end of that game. So it was brutal stuff. So that's Harold Larwood.
Just one other player we ought to mention briefly, and that's another bowler for England, a chap called Gubby Allen.
Gubby Allen was deeply unpopular with Jardine because Gubby Allen refused to bowl the way Jardine wanted to bowl at the Australians, hence the name bodyline. The method was to pack the leg side field, which is no longer allowed these days.
We'll need to break that down for our one man and his dog. So Gubby Allen.
I'm going to get a bit sick of this dog, to be honest, but there we are.
Yeah. Gubby Allen, honourable man, did the right thing.
Yes.
Yeah, absolute opposite of Jardine.
Yes.
Poor old Larwood is the stooge. And the scene is set, isn't it, there?
Quite so. And
Jardine, who hates the Australians, who fears Bradman. Now, normally, at the time, I think I'm right in saying that bowling would be aimed at what is called the off stump, there or thereabouts.
Yes, I mean, to cater for your one man and the dog.
Yeah.
If you imagine you're a batsman or you're looking at a batsman who is standing with the stumps, the three pieces of wood behind him, if you look to his left as you see him, his right, that is the offside. The leg side is the other side. In other words, literally behind his legs. So that's the offside and the leg side. Well, bodyline, they called it leg theory. So they would pack the fielders, get as many as possible on the leg side, and the bowler would be instructed to bowl the ball as aggressively as possible at the body of the batsman, hence the name bodyline. And the idea was not only to negate the scoring, particularly of Bradman, but the batsman would have to use the bat to defend himself from injury, and inevitably would probably guide the ball into the hands of one of the fielders, thereby being dismissed.
And it wasn't his original idea. It had been around for a little while, albeit in a less coherent way, but it was Jardine who insisted on this being used, wasn't it?
Yes, and if perfected is the right word, he absolutely perfected it, because yes, it had been in existence, but it had never been used as frequently or as concentratedly as a weapon, as a tactic before. And he didn't use it all the time. This is what fascinates me. He didn't use it all the time. And even Larwood was at times instructed to bowl in the traditional way. But when he did use it, because once the tour was over and they were all back, the MCC, or the English Cricket Board, as we would call it now, they instructed the England team, without Larwood, for reasons we can come on to give a demonstration match against the West Indians, with both sides using bodyline. And they disliked what they saw so much that they changed the laws very, very quickly to prevent the leg side being packed with fielders. And these days, you can only have.
We'll come on to that, Philip. But let's
Yeah.
just talk. Let's just talk about the Test series itself. It's fair to say, isn't it, that the use of bodyline, that is very fast, head, chest-high balls,
Yeah.
aimed at the body of the batsman, who at the time had no protection, no helmet, no body protection, had some deeply unpleasant consequences for the batsman involved.
Oh, well, there are three classic examples of batsmen badly injured. It was the third test in Adelaide that things really kicked off. Ironically, it was only Woodfull, the captain of Australia. He was injured while they were bowling bodyline. And as I've already alluded to, his ribs were cracked.
Yeah.
And it was him on the treatment table who was visited by Jardine, unusually for Jardine, to see how he was. And Woodfull famously said to Jardine, there are two sides out there, but only one of them is playing cricket. And that's what Woodfull said to Jardine. The other two victims in that test match were a number 3 batsman called Stan McCabe. Stan McCabe, and there's footage of this, you can see this, and it's scary even after all these years. He was hit under the heart, and they were deeply concerned about him. And they had to do what we would call CPR, resuscitation, because it stunned the heart and it put it completely out of rhythm. And then a much lower order and in those days, lower order batsmen were real rabbits. They didn't know how to bat. It's not like today when bowlers are taught to bat properly. These were real rabbits in headlights. And one of these bowlers, a spin bowler called Bertie Oldfield, Larwood hit him on the head. He was, as you pointed out, wearing only a cap. And the footage is, again, scary. He's just literally crouching down like a headless chicken, holding his head, having been hit by a ball probably at 100 miles an hour. And again, famously, Larwood goes up and apologises to Oldfield, who says, Harold, it's not your fault. It's that bee of a captain of yours. They all blame Jardine. But But the irony is that both McCabe and Oldfield, although they were injured, it wasn't to a bodyline field. That's what's so odd. That Larwood was bowling to a standard field. In other words, plenty on the offside as well as the leg side. So it was just Larwood's sheer speed and accuracy and the lift he got, the bounce he got off the pitches that caused those injuries.
Oldfield in that had his skull fractured, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. It transpired. Yeah.
And Jardine, villain of the piece, was heard to say, "Well bowled, Larwood."
He said, "Well bowled, Harold." Yeah.
Yeah. Which
he always called Larwood by his first name,
which is a significant indicator of where Jardine's views took him, which was unfortunate. I think it's right to say that the local spectators, the Australians, because of course very few people at that time travelled from England. There wasn't a balmy army. Took a great dislike to all of this.
Oh, in Adelaide, it was, yes. I mean, there was absolute uproar. And at one point, Jardine took the England team off the field.
Yeah.
Rather like Ray Ellingworth did many years later when John Snow was assaulted by a member of the crowd. No, it got very, very heated. And then, of course, whenever you want me to describe it, the politicians got involved.
Well, I was exactly going to move on to that because, of course, there were people in England who had some disquiet about the whole thing. This isn't quite cricket, chaps. In the same way that Gubby Allen, bless him, despite being out there on tour with no support, refused to join in on body.
He did. Yeah, I mean, Plum Warner, as he was known, he did keep people back home informed about what was going on.
Yeah.
And as you say, there was increasing disquiet. And then, of course, came the famous telegram.
Tell us about it.
Well, the Australian Cricket Board sent a telegram to Lords saying that the way your team is conducting itself is unsportsmanlike. Now, that in the day was like throwing a hand grenade into the long room. And what made it worse was actually the telegram and its contents were published in the newspapers before the telegram actually arrived at Lords. So it was the media, as we would call it these days, that published the telegram before the big knobs in the long room even saw it. And things got very, very nasty politically between the two governments.
And it was a problem for both sides because there were fears on both sides during the exchange of telegrams that it would affect trade.
Oh, the ramifications would have been enormous.
So way beyond cricket.
Oh yes,
it could have
quite so
adversely affected political and economic relations between England and Australia for years to come.
Yeah, I mean, there were questions raised in the House of Commons about it.
You know,
and in the end, Lords demanded a withdrawal of the word unsportsmanlike. And in the end, the Australian Cricket Board, whether of its own volition or told to do so by their government, and of course, Australia was effectively a colony still. You know, there was the Governor General who had real power. So it was basically still a British colony. So the Australian Cricket Board, to the horror of the cricketers, backed down and withdrew the word unsportsmanlike. And so the series carried on. And so did Bodyline.
Yeah.
And yes, England won the series. Bradman scored less runs than he ever had in any test series.
I'm just going to say fewer there for the people of Lewis.
What did I say that caused offence? Sorry.
You said less runs. It's fewer runs, is what you mean.
Yes.
Keith, as the sub-editor.
Could you go back to hospital, perhaps, Richard?
I will do. Yes. Yeah.
No, now. I mean, like now. Could you?
Oh, right. Okay.
Get in a cab and go to Haywards Heath. Be a good boy.
Thank you. Do you think that Warner, the co-manager of the England team on this tour, he was a very significant figure in English cricket? Do you think he could have done more? He was out there on the battlefield, as it were. Do you think he could have intervened more than he did? He did nothing, did he, really?
He did very little. I suppose he could have done more. Certainly Gubby Allen would have backed him.
Yeah.
But they were acting on instructions. This was a plan. This was like an offensive, like something military. And Jardine was determined and had the full backing to carry it out. So I don't think anybody could have really derailed it. What was he going to do? I think he felt, from what I've read, I think Warner felt that the best thing to do was hang around and do what he could, as opposed to just throw his toys out the pram and resign, because that would have left a complete vacuum and it could have got worse. Because something that Jardine didn't do was what we would say today was speak to the press.
Yeah.
But difficult one, to be honest. I mean, as you already pointed out quite rightly, these were very different days. There was no aircraft, there was no internet, there was no Wi-Fi, there were no mobile phones. It was boats that took months to arrive and on the way back. So there wasn't the communication. Things were very, very slow indeed. So yeah, the Australians backed down. We mustn't forget there was another bowler who was very much Harold's partner in crime, a bloke called Bill Vose.
Yes.
VOCE. And both he and Larwood, in the end, lived in Australia. They became Australians.
There's an odd irony there, isn't there? And
Yeah.
Ultimately, they were embraced by the Australians. I think Larwood said that there was a TV program about it, years later, and he got a few abusive phone calls. But otherwise, people were very kind and accommodating. And it says a lot.
There was a ceremony. There was a ceremony at Adelaide where he and Bill Vose, both very elderly but alive, were invited onto the field. And the crowd gave them a standing ovation, which is extraordinary, because Adelaide was the worst of those test matches.
It's extraordinarily forgiving, and it's a credit in the same way that the Australians' captain Woodfull and others dealt with it with such grace. And there are one or two people on the English side who did, but I consider it to be probably the darkest day or days for English cricket ever.
There's no doubt about that. And the sadness for me is the effect on Larwood, because no one gave a monkeys about Jardine, who was removed from the England team, let alone the captaincy, when he got back. He never played for England again. But Larwood was told by the English Cricket Board to apologise to the Australians and to the cricketing world, and he refused to. Simply refused to apologise, and he never played again for England. That wonderful fast bowler. I mean, the footage of him, I mean, we all wax lyrical these days about, oh, this bowler's got this wonderful action and, you know, isn't he marvellous? To watch Larwood bowl is an absolute pleasure. His action was just extraordinary. He was an absolute natural. Yeah. But he never played for England again because he refused to apologise. And he also never, ever criticised Jardine. Ever.
Yes.
Ever. Now, that is just blind loyalty, isn't it?
Again, it is
something of the time.
But because he's skipper and you did what skipper told you to do.
Correct.
You're not going to...
But no, I saw him interviewed shortly before his death, and he was asked about Bradman. And he basically said, I never really spoke to the man. I didn't really like him. And I agree with everything that the skipper told me to do.
Yeah. Well.
And there we are.
Now, one thing you mentioned in passing, Philip, prematurely as ever in your case, was this resulted in a change in the laws of cricket?
It did.
Just explain that to us.
Well, as I understand it, I haven't got the rule book in front of me, but within a very, very short time, given how slowly normally these people act, within a very short time, the laws were changed to forbid and to reduce the number of fielders you can have on the leg side.
Well, the leg side behind the batsman.
Behind the batsman, because if you see pictures or a recreation of the bodyline tactic, you have like an arc of fielders, but they're on the leg side behind the batsman. So it's like having 6 leg slips.
Yeah, well, so if you think about the quadrant, which is beyond the wicket, where the batsman's waiting to bat, and in fact where their bum's facing,
yeah,
that area now can only contain 2 fielders, no more.
Correct.
And that is a direct result of body line.
That's right.
An attempt to control it, because originally I think they thought that teams would say, this isn't very gentlemanly, we won't do this.
Well, again,
and that didn't work.
No, it didn't work or wouldn't work. As I've already said, they set up that demonstration match before the footage that we can see today from the actual Bodyline series got back to England. And they simply did not like what they saw.
No.
Which is good, because it's a mean way of playing cricket, very mean way.
Well, and at the time, a very dangerous way of playing cricket.
Well, I mean, you mentioned the lack of protection. I mean, again, in this program, it was recreated what a batsman wore, and it's just pathetic. There was no body protection at all. There was a box that sort of covered your genitals. The gloves were almost useless. They were just like cloth gloves with the finger bits and the thumb bit covered in like little
spikes.
Sorry?
Spikes. Little
spikes. That's the word I'm looking for. And I remember wearing those at primary school. They were like schoolboys, and they were useless. And then the cap facing 100-mile-an-hour deliveries. Oh, because this program showed they recreated the upper human torso in a very realistic way. And they got one of these bowling machines to fire at this torso at 100 miles an hour. And after 4 deliveries, the thing had exploded. Hey, Jed.
He's come to say hello.
Hello, Jez.
Oh, Jed,
hello.
There he is.
I'm in your favourite place.
We might go there later. Sorry, Phil, you carry on.
No, I've nothing more to say, really. I wish I would.
Can I just ask a couple of questions? Or make a couple of statements or whatever. First of all, you talked about the players and gentlemen. It did actually show 1 or 2 moments of magic in cricket. I think I remember as a little boy watching a news clip of a players versus gentlemen, and Prince Philip was playing for the gentlemen.
Yes.
Would that
I'm
be?
Sure.
Yeah. And secondly, in our studio, which we gave up last week, in the 1930s, the British foreign minister and the Russian ambassador resumed diplomatic relations in the sheriff's room. And it is said that afterwards they went and played 2 overs of cricket in the hallway, in the corridors of the White Hart Hotel. That's my contribution to this.
Yeah, my personal cricket story is going to Arundel. Beautiful ground, isn't it, Philip?
It is an absolute gem. Yeah.
And I went to see Sussex play Hampshire. 1-day game with my friend Matthew. And I think it's fair to say that drinks were taken. And at the end of the game, we wandered off into the night. And I had the opportunity of saying, I saw somebody about to get onto a coach, and I said, Shane, shook hands, bad luck, mate. Hampshire lost. And it was Shane Warne.
Blimey.
So that hand there, and he passed none of his finger knowledge to that hand. I can promise you that when I bowl. Just coming back to bodyline, it's an interesting little factor that despite all that happened, Bradman, as you say, Phil, is considered, beyond question, the consummate batsman. He got 29 Test centuries in his career. Jardine, the villain of the piece, got one.
Yeah. And you have to remember that they played far less cricket in those days.
Oh yeah, completely. So Bradman's totals are just extraordinary. And the other thing I like about Bradman is that he was almost exactly my height.
That's correct.
He was a little fella.
He had a very low central gravity. That's correct.
But unfortunately, that's where the similarities in terms of cricket end, because he had ball-eye coordination, timing, etc. And I tend to fumble.
Well, look, just reassure yourself that he too would have got lost in a bonfire night procession.
Yeah, I can see that. And I don't think he would have been any good at cross-examining. Not saying I am, but I'd probably take him on that in a contest. Or, well, he's dead, so it's easier for me to say that, isn't it? I'm not going to call him out and say, "Come on, then, Don, let's go and have a debate."
Well, when I used to commute from the big city, I was on a very late train coming back to Arundel, and I booked a cab from the rubbish cab company that we have down here, who have a complete monopoly on everything. So I booked a cab. It really was very late. And as I got off the train, I was conscious of one other person getting off the train and thought little more of it. I get to the cab, was about to get in. This chap asked the cabin where the reception is for a taxi, and they said, "Sorry, sir, this is the last cab we've got." And so this chap came over and said, "May I ask where you're going?" And I said where I was going, which happened to be very near where he was going. And I said, "Why don't you share the cab?" "Thank you very much." In we get. I suddenly realised who it was. It was Colin Cowdrey. It was Colin Cowdrey, who was married, because the old Duke of Arundel, who was a Catholic, Bernard, married Lavinia, who was a Protestant or non-Catholic. And they had 4 daughters, all of whom were brought up as Anglicans, not Catholics. And Cowdrey had married one of those daughters, and they lived on the Arundel estate. And that's where he was going. So I was on a road called King Street, which is very high up, near the cathedral. So for him, the cab was just one further little leg into the park. But it was Colin Cowdrey, absolutely charming man, and he refused to let me pay. So I had a free taxi ride home with a bit of a legend, which was rather nice.
Indeed. Well, gentlemen, we've been going for well over an hour now. I think it's time to let you get back into court. And fascinating memories, and indeed your usual deep knowledge of the subject, Philip. And the Inquisitor did a very good job, I thought. So we'll leave it there for Friday from our new headquarters. This is the very first program to come out of the Black Horse, and I hope that this will continue as of Monday. So thank you both very much. And,
Bye bye, Keith. Bye bye, Richard.
Bye bye.
We'll see you then. Take care.
And you, Keith.
From Lewis in the Black Horse Pub.
Back in just a minute or two. Well, 5 minutes or so.